Hi, Michael.
Hi,
How are
Veronica.
you?
Good to meet you. Very good. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. So, welcome to Twimbit's Virtual Banking Leadership Insights. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you
Michael,
for
you're
having me.
an Sure. Thank you. So, you're an artificial intelligence and fintech leader, and you've just co-authored a book called the AI Book. So, without further ado, could you please tell us more about the book and yourself in general?
Sure. So I'm a director for AI and fintech at PwC Germany. I've essentially left my role in London after working globally out of London for 17 years, pretty much on 5 continents with more than 200 clients. So I'm now kind of looking into getting Germany ahead in terms of artificial intelligence, and then also helping the company and the clients to fully leverage the benefits from that. My day-to-day work really is very client-driven and depends. So usually I will build a number of different digital products, usually with machine learning, AI, sometimes also in the fintech domain. Really depends on what we are working on at the moment. For the book, that's been a longer journey. This is kind of sourced from a number of global experts. So sometime a year ago, I kind of reflected on my work in AI to date. So back then it was about 6 years and hands-on experience leading a data science team in different domains. Some of the work was in financial services, particularly financial crime, compliance, those areas. But other work has also been in government and healthcare.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Michael. So, to begin with, I will just set up the context for today's conversation between us. So, what I think is that the world is moving towards a new normal with the realization of data's power, adoption of mobile first mindset, and experience based UI and UX consumers. Now, with that, there's a profound effect of this change on the banking ecosystem, where digital only and virtual banking is exhibiting a multitude of opportunities for bankers, regulators, consumers, developers, and fintech players. So, the biggest building block for virtual banking today is data. And the most effective use of data is through applying artificial intelligence, AI. One of the quotes that you mentioned in your study by Sundar Pichai, who's Google CEO, is that AI to be probably the most important thing humanity has ever worked on. So, bringing that to today's banking industry, I would like to begin by understanding how is AI helping traditional and challenger banks in their digital only journey?
So it helps them in a number of ways, in quite a few different areas. When I worked with the US institution some longer time ago, they first got into AI by solving some of the challenges they had in financial crime, whether it was the FX manipulation or LIBOR manipulation, affecting trillions worth of dollar of instruments globally. So it wasn't the drive for innovation, it was the drive to having to deal with really complex problems where you needed to understand language at scale, but in a very nuanced way to deal with this. The American institutions today have now moved on. They have built very strong AI platforms, whether you wanted to use it for collateral, for trading, automating a lot of these processes in the banks. So when you think about the big players from the JP Morgans, Morgan Stanley, Goldman and such, they are all investing billions each year in AI-related fields, so from the data cleansing. Looking at the study that we've just conducted with 151 participants across the German-speaking region in Europe, we are not finding quite the same maturity of use cases here. Here initially, when you conduct the study, it was quite clear that people are looking to use AI for cost savings, for efficiency, for speeding up things, and very few are looking to really change the client relationship or building an entirely new business on this. Then just looking into Asia, where I've also had the pleasure of working with a number of Asian banks, also Singapore, Hong Kong, and then some mainland China. Fortunately, none in India just yet, but I'm sure that will come. They're using it to empower what you kind of mentioned as mobile only, or using it in a way to drive additional revenue opportunities. So you can kind of think about the WeChat and other systems where very good profiling is done of the client. Client perceives some benefits in terms of having more convenience, being able to choose from a number of products that would actually help them personally, and then can then go ahead. So there's always the balance between sharing my data, but getting something in return.
Of course. So one of the things that while I was studying Asia's virtual banks is VBank, if you've heard, which is one of the unicorn virtual bank in mainland China. They did a couple of partnerships with Tencent Cloud and Mila, which is a deep learning research facility, which they're basically aiming at protecting data privacy and enabling cross-border collaborations. So one of the things that I want to understand is that how these partnerships or how these AI partnerships fit into a digital banking journey in terms of business models.
I feel, and that is probably the sense also from the American banks and even the ones here, is that when they started to go on that journey, they would have taken too long to go there themselves. So when we think back some 10, 15 years ago, it was very difficult as a vendor to enter a bank and kind of to get a foot in the door. In some ways, Fintech and some of the accelerators that the banks started, whether we talk about Barclays, Techstars, and others, they changed this. So the speed is which you can work with a vendor, and it was a desire, a realization that you cannot solve all the problems that you have yourself. You need to look outside. You want to look at very fast, innovative solutions and give them some room to play, and maybe approach problems in one area with technology that was actually built for something else. So we've seen a lot of those partnerships. We've seen a lot of investment by the banks in smaller players, just to get an idea of what their technology is doing, and then eventually bringing them in as a vendor. I think this is just the way of, let's say, big corporates to innovate. They know that they need to look outside, and that often works through these partnerships.
Interesting. So with that, what do you think are the blockers to AI adoption?
So the ones I've seen in my study, and I would say they would probably vary per country if you were doing that study on a global scale. The block number one is still the availability of data. So a lot of the homework, some of the bigger banks in this region have at least started with it, but they're still trying to put something into a Hadoop or Spark or a central system where it can be used by data science and other means. But from the percentages of the shared data available, we are still at low maturity. Other countries, particularly US, they've started that big data analytics exercise a longer time ago, and then within the institution, much more of the data is available and is actually being used. Yeah, we've all been in these big projects where you create yet another central data warehouse, what it was called 10 years ago, where you just, whether it makes sense or not, you just pile on the data. This alone can't be meaningful. It has to be used for the right use cases. So depending on what type of institutions you talk to, if you talk, for example, with the insurance companies in Europe, you find slightly higher maturity in average when it comes to collecting the right amount of data at scale. So in terms of methods and get the performance that you need, but also having the kind of quality right and the coverage right. So this is something that we are still going through in this region, where other regions are much further down the way. I would say working with some of the Chinese institutions, they know what they're missing. They know exactly, okay, if I want to go after that on that client in Europe, I need to do this via partnerships. And sometimes I do these partnerships to be able to get a sense of the data that I'm missing. And then I'm looking into purchasing and so on. So very strategically going after this.
Interesting. So, like you mentioned, that it really depends on the use cases, how you're making the data meaningful. So, with that, there are two popular use cases for digital acceleration in banks, and specifically in challenger banks with virtual banks, where they need a robust risk management system because customer onboarding is happening digitally, and to create customized offerings. That's what differentiates them from traditional banks. So, how do you think AI helps them in doing so?
So when I look at the challenger banks in Europe, and I can speak to quite a few of them, back in London when I was in level 39, we had Revolut literally on the same floor. But I also know the likes of Monzo and Starling, but then also in Germany N26. And then you've got in Brazil and probably quite a few others in Asia. But I don't really want to compare with the likes of Ant Financial. So if I talk about the institutions that I've just mentioned, it's quite interesting how they used AI to solve their own KYC things, maybe not always initially fully successfully, but then trying to automate this. In a typical KYC onboarding process, what you have is such a additional system for, let's say, tricky cases, which is called the enhanced due diligence. And that one, you try to pull together as much information as you can from unstructured sources as well. So not just news about the person who's trying to join you as a customer, but maybe some past records and so on, to kind of have a really good insight in terms of the connections to other countries, maybe to sanctions and so on. So that's very typical and popular use case. And the other one is then really the breakout in terms of how can I offer something personal for the client. I would say, at least in the German regions, that is not done at scale yet because of very strict data privacy rules. But back in the English institutions, I could see how they customized over chat, trying to look at transactions of the customer, and then dependent on that, looking what products can I offer them. You have to think about the challenger banks very early on. They are not profitable, so they have an amount of money that they are losing per customer they have on their book. So let's say that it's £20. But then the traditional banks would have £100 that it costs them to have a customer. To make that a break-even event, or to really make some money with the customer, they need to quickly get into an ecosystem partner, maybe with insurance, other things, investments, and then try to recoup some of this money via those partnerships.
Great. So, like you mentioned, the KYC process, it's something that really is essential, and AI actually helps them to do so in a more effective and efficient way. So, shifting gears over here, one of the things that you mentioned was the first step to winning customer trust is by ensuring their information is correct, lawful, and up to date. Which brings me to a critical question, and it's related to data privacy. So, what hinders customers to onboard to digital-only and challenger banks is trust. And how do you think AI can help lack of customer trust problem? I know partly you've answered in your previous answer, but if we had to think more structurally, then how do you think AI would solve that?
Maybe I need to take a step back from the question and just really state that I guess the whole trust in the banking system has been severely disrupted through the last financial crisis. This was the point where if you had your brick and mortar bank, it didn't matter how many branches they had or how nice they looked. Pretty much everybody got disrupted in their trust in financial services institutions, which then in some ways, and that's my other big topic, gave rise to fintech and website-only banks or mobile-only bank, where I'm not sure I can trust my bank, so I might go to an alternative service. And in the end, they need to offer something that I want in terms of having a nicer interface and easier switch on, switch off, maybe more insight into the transaction, there needs to be some benefit. If I get that benefit, I'm very happy to share some more personal data, but that benefit needs to be clear to me up front, and then I will to the transition. And that is true for, let's say, data transparency, as well as then kind of how do I gain customers in that segment. Sure, there will be different types of segments and customers. Some of them might be more, maybe the slightly younger segment might be more interested in using a mobile-only bank and having different requirements, but that's one thing. Maybe then from the AI perspective, it's a trust that the institutions will not use my data against me. It's a trust and a unbiased decision making in the background, and a trust in something like a responsible AI framework. I mean, a lot of institutions, including PwC, are really pushing for having these checks for in a data model around bias, as well as robustness and building models ethically. That's why we've come up with this responsible AI framework, which allows a lot of these checks to be performed when you actually look at customer data and the decisions based on that.
Great. So I read it in a book once that technology, to be effective and appropriate, it must be married with ethical and cultural practices. And you just rightly pointed out that you've created these responsible check and balances of framework, which helps to ensure that. But when it actually comes in practice, there are areas where there are unintentional and unethical decisions that are arising from AI algorithms, which rather can be counter-attack towards the trust building practice. How do you think that we can mitigate that?
When I was based in London, I would speak about AI or fintech every other week, and I used to compare AI in my speeches with nuclear power, saying itself is just a tool, but it depends how it's used. Now, nuclear power has a slightly negative connotation, so over the years I've changed my explanation more towards the internet. The internet is the same in some ways, where it's there. It can contain good information. It can contain bad information. It depends how people are using it. And any new technology, when it emerges, will take some time to mature. So for the regulators to pick up, for other people to demand more transparency in terms of the algorithms used. But this all takes time. There's the same with internet. I mean, until the social media platforms picked up on, okay, there's people manipulating elections and political agendas via us, and now we have to have a task force who is looking at bots spamming messages. All of this is a learning process, is part of the maturity journey. And it's kind of like, if you want to be ahead and understand where the world is going, then you probably don't want to be in the 90s and say, I want to leave the internet to other people. I just sit back and wait. And I think the same is true with AI. I mean, yes, it can be used for can have negative effects. It can be used for non-ethical means as well. But I think over time, I have the trust that the issues from that side will be resolved, and that things will be made transparent. In the end, it does depend on the mentality. If you make it clear to the people what benefit they get, they will decide for themselves whether they use it. And I believe in the free choice of people, whether they want to buy into a system or not. So I wouldn't enforce it upon them either way, but I would give them the choice. That means I, as a challenger bank, or I, as a vendor, need to make it very transparent. What is the benefit to each individual? And then I will get the buy-in.
Great. So I like that you mentioned that it's a mentality change. And one of the things that I think is that there is a shift in banks from being guardians of money to being guardians of customers' personal data. And what I read in Chris Skinner's book on digital bank, which he talks about that people try to rob banks online instead of its branches, because online is where the money is. The money is in the data. So that brings me to the question that how are banks and challenger banks safeguarding customers' data privacy?
And I just had to smile a little bit when I was London-based. I met Chris Skinner, and I've been to some other book launches from him. Unfortunately, not that one. But yes, I mean the bank really has to ensure that it will be a safe place to hold this data. That means in terms of the cybersecurity attacks, in terms of having a lot of protection around this, having a government and governance and a control framework to prevent breaches, but then also being proactive and knowledge sharing in terms of what they're doing with the data. So if they really want to get to this place of trust and transparency, then it should be clear to the clients what the data is used for. And then the bank needs to do their best to protect it and use it in a wise way. I mean, it's the fact that the legacy banks, yes, they have a lot of the customer data, but they are not really, when you think about data is the new oil, if you want to put it this way, they're not really putting that through the pipeline just yet. There's a lot of complacency, a lot of sitting on this treasure. They haven't all found ways to use this. It's a kind of like, what use cases do you want to go for that actually create a benefit for the client, and where do you want to go with this?
Right. I think that makes total sense. So this brings us to the end of our discussion, but I would like to ask the last question, like a closing note, Michael. So what do you think are the opportunities for AI in future of banking?
I personally think that, at least in Europe, we are still at the beginning of this journey for AI banking. There's a lot of things that we can't even imagine now. Even when you read the AI book, and I read that what other co-authors have written about the future of AI and what is possible, I would say it's very, very tough. It's such a dynamic area to predict more than even a couple of years ahead. If you had to predict like 5 or 10 years ahead in AI, which is, as you stated, Google CEO is one of the driving forces and one of the important areas. So there's so much change. It's very difficult to come up with something. I personally think that from the use cases we've seen, we're not even at 10% now of the total field of what's actually possible. I think about making the whole banking as a service, or making it even more virtual, having a bank advisor with you on shopping and on. There's a lot of different elements to this. Yeah.
Great. So thank you, Michael. That was a really interesting conversation. It was a pleasure talking to you. So thank you for taking out your time.
Thank you very much, Vanika. Pleasure talking to you also. Looking forward to continue our discussion at a future time.
Yes, surely. Okay. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Take care. Thank you.